Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's hearing. Today we're going to hear evidence from Mr. James Harrison of Cadent, which was the body responsible for transporting gas to Grenfell Tower. So, Ms. Hines.
Good morning, sir, and good morning to members of the panel. Yes, may I please call Mr. James Harrison of Cadent Gas Limited.
Thank you. Good morning, Mr. Harrison.
Good morning.
I understand you're going to take the oath.
I am.
So there should be a testament there. Could you hold the book in your right hand, please, and read the words on the screen?
I swear by Almighty God that the evidence I shall give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Good. Thank you very much indeed. Do sit down. Make yourself comfortable there. There's water there if you'd like some. All right.
Yeah.
Get cracking.
Yeah.
Yes, Ms. Hines.
Thank you. Good morning, Mr. Harrison, and thank you very much for coming to the inquiry to assist us. If you've any difficulty in understanding my questions, please just say and I'll ask it in a different way. We're going to take scheduled breaks today, one in the morning and one in the afternoon, but if you need a break at any other point, please just let me know. And please keep your voice up so the transcriber who's sitting to your right can take down your evidence clearly. Now, you've made 5 witness statements. Can we go to MET 12831, please? This is your statement dated the 30th of January 2018 to the Metropolitan Police. It's 17 pages long, and I'll call this your first MPS statement. Can we now go to MET 18804? This is your second statement to the Metropolitan Police, and it's dated the 29th of June 2018. It's 12 pages long, and I'll call that your second MPS statement. Can we go to CAD 402985? This is your first statement to the inquiry, and we can see at the top that it's dated 19th of October 2018, and I'll call this your first inquiry statement. Can we go to page 24, please? We see there's a signature there. Is that your signature?
Yes, yes.
Can we go to CAD 403019? This is your second statement to the inquiry. And if we look at the bottom of the page, we can see that it's dated 13th of November 2018. I'll call that your second inquiry statement. And is that your signature there at the bottom?
It is, yes.
Finally, can we go to CAD 403043? This is your third statement to the inquiry, and it's dated 19th of March 2021. Can we please go to page 15? We can see a signature. Is that your signature?
That's an electronic signature that I use, but that is my statement.
Thank you. Have you read each of these statements recently?
I have, yes.
Can you confirm that the contents of each of them is true?
I can. Yes.
Thank you. I want us to start by talking about your education and your experience. I understand that you graduated in 1999 with a degree in civil engineering. Is that right?
That is correct.
And after university, did you work for MJ Gleeson Group?
For a very short period of time.
How long did you work with them?
I worked for them for 1 year during my sandwich placement and then for a couple of months after graduating.
And what was your role with them?
I was a setting out engineer.
Now, I understand that after your period with MJ Gleeson, you were accepted onto a graduate course with what was then known as Transco. Is that right?
Yes.
Did Transco then become National Grid PLC?
Transco and National Grid merged, so yes, they did.
I see. Is it right that when you started the graduate scheme, Transco operated the gas transmission and distribution systems in the UK?
Correct, yes.
Now, in that graduate scheme, did you get hands-on experience in gas distribution and supply?
I did, yes.
Can you give us an example or a few examples of the roles that you had?
It was an 18-month programme, and I decided to do a 6-month placement working as a first call operative, working alongside first call operatives. And
pausing there, Mr. Harrison, what's a first call operative?
First call operatives are the engineers that go to a gas escape when a member of the public call it in.
Right. And were you also a technician in the repair side?
Yeah, I took up a role working with as a technician in the repair side
And what's the difference between repair and first call?
First call go to a publicly reported gas escape to determine the level of escape, and then the repair teams will follow that up and, if needed, fix the gas pipe that's leaking.
Right. And what I'm getting at is that you were not sitting behind a desk for this role. You were in amongst the pipes, as it were.
Yes, I was working in the field.
Right. And I understand that after your graduate role, you became a network supervisor. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Now, is that a management role?
It's a first level of management role.
Right. And since then, have you worked in a variety of management roles?
I have, yes.
Are you a chartered gas engineer?
I am, yes.
Do you know, or can you recall when you got that accreditation?
Around 2010, 2011.
Thank you. We won't hold you to the exact date. No. Would I be right to say that you have 20 years of operational gas experience?
Yes.
And you've had, I think you've answered this question, but just to be sure, you've had experience dealing with, on one hand, gas emergencies, and on the other hand, planned repair.
I've dealt with gas emergencies, planned repair and maintenance and replacement of the gas network.
What's the difference? You've drawn a distinction between maintenance and replacement. Can you explain the difference between that?
Yeah, maintenance is when we go out and we do proactive checks and maintenance on our pressure reduction equipment and our high pressure pipelines.
Well, you've used the word proactive. I understand also that there's something called reactive works. Could you explain the difference between those?
Yeah, the reactive works was largely what I was doing when I worked in emergency and repair, where we're reacting to a call in from a member of the public. Proactive is where we go and gather evidence and data on our assets and then make proactive interventions on those assets.
Right. Now, when you made your first 4 statements, your role was Head of Operations for the Emergency Response and Repair Network. But when you made your more recent statement of March this year, your role is Director for the North London Network. When did you start that role?
I started the Director role in April 2019.
And is it still your role?
It is, yeah.
Were you promoted to that role?
I was.
Now, I've understood from your witness statement that you were directly involved in the events of the fire at Grenfell Tower. And in fact, you attended on the 14th of June 2017 during the works to isolate the supply. Is that right?
Yes.
And that was in your capacity as Head of Operations for North London Emergency Response and Repair?
Yes.
Can you explain where that team sits within the organisation?
Sorry.
If we look at the organisation, perhaps I can prompt you. There's an operations team. Is that within the operations team at Cadent Gas?
It is, yes.
And there's another team, which I understand is called the Operate and Maintain Department. Is that a separate team?
No, the Operate and Maintain team is within the operations team.
I see, but there's 2 separate teams, Operate and Maintain and Emergency
Yes.
Response.
Yeah.
I see. Would the Operate and Maintain Department have been the department that dealt with the replacement riser at Grenfell Tower 2016-17?
No, they weren't.
So which department would have been dealing with the replacement riser in 2016-17?
That was dealt with by a department called CMAC,
Right.
which was run by a colleague of mine called Steve Mason.
And what...
Excuse me, it sounds as though CMAC's an acronym.
Sorry, construction management. I can't remember the rest of the acronym.
Perhaps it's contract management and construction?
Correct, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thinking back to 2016, you've mentioned Steve Mason. Can you tell me what his role was in 2016?
Yes, Steve was a colleague of mine who was running the contract with Trio to replace gas pipes in London and in the East of England network.
Would you personally have had much to do directly with the CMAC team during 2016-17?
In my capacity in the East of England, yes.
But not in the north of London?
No, not in the London network.
You have very helpfully, however, given us evidence about how operations worked in Caden across that operations team. and to an extent within the CMAC team. And what I really want to understand is your evidence based on your knowledge and experience of Cadent as an organisation?
It is, yes.
And is it also based on your reading of documents since the fire?
It is, yes.
I want to ask you a little more about Cadent as an entity. My understanding is that up until the 30th of November, it was called National Grid plc, and it owned and operated some of the gas distribution networks in the UK. Is that right?
Up until the 30th of September 2016, and then on the 1st of April 2017, it became its own separate entity as we separated from National Grid.
Well, I've understood, actually, if I can just take it in stages, that on the 1st of October 2016, the gas distribution part of National Grid plc became National Grid Gas Distribution Limited.
That's correct.
And then that entity became Cadent, in fact, as you say, I think that's on the 1st of May 2017.
Okay, 1st of May, yes.
Would you like to have a look at the...
No, I didn't know whether it was the 1st of April or the 1st of May.
I believe your witness statement says 1st of May. Okay. But in any event, from October 2016, was it a private company as opposed to a public company?
Yes.
And is it a commercial enterprise?
No, it's a regulated company.
Well, that's something I want to ask you about next, actually. Can we go to your first inquiry statement at page 2, which is CAD 402985. At paragraph 7, you say this: Cadent is a gas transporter, which means that it owns and operates pipes and associated apparatus which supply natural gas to commercial and domestic properties within the geographic footprint of its distribution networks. Cadent owns and operates 4 of the 8 regulated gas distribution networks in the UK, namely the East of England, the North West, the West Midlands and North London, where Grenfell Tower, the tower, is located. Cadent manages its networks, including connecting new customers and responding to reported gas escapes. It also manages the National Gas Emergency Service number on behalf of all gas distribution networks. So breaking that up into smaller chunks, does that mean that Cadent transports the gas through the network to consumers, put simply?
It does, yes.
Cadent doesn't actually own the gas.
No, we don't.
Cadent owns and operates the pipes and apparatus that transport the gas.
Correct, yes.
And when you say geographic footprint, do you mean that Cadent has responsibility for transporting gas within a defined area?
Yes, I do.
And you say Cadent's responsible for 4 of the 8 regulated gas distribution networks, and you gave us a list of the coverage, East of England being one of them and North London being another. What do you mean by the 8 regulated gas distribution networks?
There are 8 regulated gas distribution networks in the UK. In 2005, National Grid sold or separated 4 of those gas distribution networks and kept the other 4. So that would be Scotia Gas, which covers Scotland, Southern Gas, Northern Gas Networks, and Wales and the West.
Thank you very much. Do you recognise the term distribution network operator?
I do, yes.
What does that mean?
That means that we own and operate the distribution network as opposed to the gas transmission network. If I can explain, the gas transmission network would be like the motorway of gas pipes when gas comes into the country. The gas distribution networks would be more like the A roads and B roads taking the gas from the transmission network to customers' properties.
And so just to clarify that analogy, Caden Gas would be responsible for the A and B roads?
In that analogy, it
yes. There's also something called an independent gas transporter. Can you tell us what they are?
Independent gas transporters tend to be much smaller networks where they own the pipes within a smaller geographical network.
So would I be right to give it as an example, an independent gas transporter might cover the gas going into a new housing development or a contained commercial park?
Yes.
Right. Now, you've said that Cadent operates the emergency service number on behalf of all gas transporters. Is that right?
That is right, yes.
Now, just considering the size and position of Cadent, would you agree that Cadent is one of the leading gas transporters, if not actually the leading gas transporter?
It's one of the largest, or is the largest.
I want to turn now to look at exactly what parts of a network, these A and B roads, as you say, that the gas transporter is responsible for. My understanding is that a gas transporter is responsible for all of the pipe work from the motorway, to extend that analogy, up to a valve called the emergency control valve, sometimes called an ECV. Is that right?
Yes, it is.
Can you tell us what an ECV is?
An emergency control valve is the last point before the network goes into the customer's ownership. It's used to turn off the gas supply within their properties.
Who can turn off an ECV?
Cadent engineers can, gas safe engineers can, and also owners and residents in those properties can.
So to give us a picture, if, say, I smelled gas in my flat and I phoned Cadent's emergency number, they might tell me that I could turn the ECV.
They would tell you to turn the ECV off.
Where would you typically find an ECV?
It's by the meter.
By the consumer meter?
Yes.
Yeah. And just to clarify, Cadent's responsible for the pipework up to and including the ECV, is that right?
That's correct.
Now, I've seen in documents that some of the pipes are called risers and some are called laterals. Can you just help us to understand what a riser is?
Yes, in flats, in multi-occupancy buildings, the riser is the main pipe which runs vertically. They can sometimes run horizontally within a high-rise building. We then have laterals, which are branches from the riser, which go to customers' meter points.
So the word riser seems to suggest to me that it's vertical, but you're saying that sometimes they can rise.
Very rarely they're horizontal, but the vast majority are vertical.
When would you call a horizontal riser, a horizontal pipe a riser?
If it was the main branch pipe going along.
I see. Now, beyond the ECV, there's things like pipes going to the meter and connectors, there's the meter, and then there's pipework that goes to the to the appliances, so a cooker or whatever else is connected. I'm going to call the pipework and the apparatus that's downstream, so on the consumer side, I'm going to call that installation pipework. And everything that's upstream, I'm going to call that service pipework. So just to be absolutely sure I've got the definition correctly, Cadent would be responsible for the service pipework, but not the installation pipework.
That's correct.
Who's responsible for the installation pipework and apparatus?
The owner of the property.
And the panel's heard evidence in this module about gas safety checks in the flats at Grenfell. Those checks, would they have been on the installation pipework and apparatus?
They would, yes.
And does it follow from your evidence that those checks were not to do with Cadent at all?
No, they're not Cadent's responsibility.
Right. I want to ask you now about how gas transporters are monitored and regulated. First, the Health and Safety Executive. Can you explain what the HSE does in relation to gas distribution and supply?
The Health and Safety Executive is effectively our safety regulator.
Would I be right to say they're responsible for all of the safety of the gas distribution and supply?
You would, yes.
Now, I've seen something called a gas safety case. Can you explain what a gas safety case is?
The gas safety case is a document that the gas transporters own that sets out how they're going to run their gas distribution network or their network.
And does the HSE have any involvement with the gas safety case?
Yeah, we send and share the safety case with the HSE.
And is every gas transporter required to have one?
Yes.
How often does the HSE view your gas safety cases?
I don't know exactly how often it is. I think it's whenever there's a material change within the way the company's organised, or every... I'll get the information to you if you need.
I think it might be that in absence of any material change, the gas transporter has to review their gas safety case and produce it to the HSE every 3 years. Does that sound correct?
That sounds correct. Either 3 or 5 years was what I was going to say.
Thank you. There's another entity called Ofgem. Who are they?
Ofgem are our economic regulator, so they set out the funding that we have to run our gas network.
Would it be fair to say they monitor price of gas and competitiveness of gas pricing?
They monitor the competitiveness of the gas distribution networks, how we perform between each other, and they are also involved in gas pricing, although that has no relevance to Cadent gas pricing.
Why do you say that?
Because we don't own the gas, we just transport it.
I understand. Now, as a gas transporter, does Cadent have a number of legal duties?
We do, yes.
Yeah, we can find various regulations that apply to industry. You've already mentioned Stephen Mason. I just want to go to something he says because he summarises it very quickly. Can we go to his first witness statement at CAD 704, page 2? And at paragraph 5, he says, Cadent has a duty to connect customers whose premises are situated horizontally within 23 metres from a relevant gas main. Cadent also has a duty to maintain gas connection until such time as it is no longer required by the owner or occupier of the premises. Now, just as a summary of Cadent's duty to connect, do you agree with that?
I do. That's section 10 from the Gas Act.
Quite right. Can we now look at the Pipeline Safety Regulation 1996? That's at can we actually look at your first inquiry statement at page 5? That's CAD 402985, page 5. Paragraph 19, you say, Cadent has a duty to ensure that all of its assets are in a safe and reliable condition. Specifically, Regulation 13 of the Pipeline Safety Regulation 1996 states, and here you quote the regulations, the operator shall ensure that a pipeline is maintained in an efficient state, in efficient working order, and in good repair. Now, can I take it from that you agree that the Pipeline Safety Regulation 1996 applies to the service pipework for which Cadent is responsible?
I do, yes.
And do you agree that one of the purposes of this regulation is to keep the service pipework safe?
Yes.
And do you accept that this duty encompasses all of the apparatus, keeping them all in good repair, which would include valves and valve chambers?
I do, yes.
Now can we go to the Pipeline Safety Regulation at 1996? We'll find that at INQ 3014790. And can we go to page 5 of that, please? And at the bottom of page 5, we see Regulation 8, Materials. The operator shall ensure that no fluid is conveyed in a pipeline unless it is composed of materials which are suitable. Are you familiar with that regulation?
I'm aware of it, yes.
Can we now go to page 9 and look at Regulation 16? Regulation 16 is in the middle of the page there. For the purpose of ensuring that no damage is caused to a pipeline, the operator shall take such steps to inform persons of its existence and whereabouts as are reasonable. Are you familiar with that regulation?
Yes.
Would you expect every Cadent operative to be familiar or broadly familiar with those regulatory duties?
Yeah, through our company policies and procedures, I would.
Well, that's a perfect segue into my next set of questions, which are about those policies and procedures. I want to understand about how Cadent uses these, and we'll come on to the detail of them as they apply to Grenfell in a moment. I'm just thinking generally, if we step back, one of the ways that Cadent meets its regulatory duties, I understand, is by having a rolling programme of surveys and condition inspections. Is that right?
That is correct.
And presumably, if Cadent finds something within those surveys that's not safe or efficient, Cadent would take action on them.
Or it would, and in addition, something that requires further investigation.
Very well. And I think you've answered this question. Through the policies and procedures, Cadent intends to meet its statutory requirements, the duties we've just looked at.
Yes.
I see. Can we go to CAD 402996? This is a document at the top. We can see it has a reference of TPL LC20, and it's called Policy for Inspection, Maintenance and Monitoring of Supplies to High and Medium Rise Buildings. I'm going to call this the LC20 policy. We can see that it's about high-rise buildings. Why would Cadent need a dedicated policy for buildings of this of height?
Because they're of a different nature to the other assets that we own, and we would need a specific procedure in order to investigate and to survey those buildings.
Can you tell us how they're different from other buildings?
Well, the majority of our high-rise buildings are kind of in a... Sorry, I'll start again. Our gas pipes out in the road are easily accessible by our engineers, whereas high-rise buildings are made up of several dwellings and different communal areas where we need to have specific access to enter those, which is different to our gas mains, normal standard domestic dwellings as they were, or smaller medium-rise flats.
Right. And just thinking about what this policy covers, am I right to say that what it says in brief is high-rise buildings will be surveyed periodically?
That is correct, yes.
And they'll be given a building priority score, is that right?
That is right.
And is it right that the score that they get will determine the frequency with which they are surveyed?
That is correct.
Can you give us an idea of the sorts of timescales?
They would be surveyed every 1, 5 or 10 years.
And would I be right to say that any building over 210,000 on your scoring system would then go to a particular process where it's considered in more detail?
Yes.
Let's turn to that. Can we go to CAD 402987? There's a table at the bottom of this front page, and we can see the first line of that table gives it the code of TPM-LC21. And if we go, we can actually see the title in that box there, and it's the Management Procedure for the Asset Management of Gas Supplies to Multi-Occupancy High and Medium-Rise Buildings. I'm going to call this the LC21 Management Procedure. And to get an idea of what this covers, can we go to the index at page 4? And I want to just draw your attention to section 5, which is building surveys. And we see those terms that you've used already, proactive work and reactive work. And at 5.4, we see that there'd be coverage about engagement with building owners, preparation of pre-survey work. And at 5.6, we see particular details in this index of high-rise building surveys. If we just draw our attention down to item number 6, I'm sorry, it's just dropped off my page. Can you see the item number 6, Mr. Harrison?
No, I can see 6, gas leak found during survey.
Yes, exactly. And beneath that, item 7, asset strategy process.
Yes, I can see those.
And we see there under 7, we see at 7.2, for example, that building priority score that we were just talking about. And we see that number at 7.3, 210,000. We see some details of survey frequency and also specific provisions of severe corrosion reported. So looking at that, now there is more over the page, which we can go to if you need it. But looking at that, does this LC21 set out a procedure for conducting surveys?
It does, yes.
And also a procedure for what should happen once the survey data comes back?
It does, yes.
Now, we saw at 8.1 on this page, Hazop risk assessment. What does Hazop stand for?
It's a hazard operability study.
And what's a Hazop risk assessment?
So when we get the data back from our surveys, we will look at the priority score and look at some of the data that we found. The Hazop risk assessment then would step through a series of actions that we would need to fulfil.
Very well. Can we go to a new document, CAD 403001? And in the table at the bottom, we can see that its reference is TPRLC34. And it's called the Work Procedure for High-Rise Building Surveys and Risk Assessment. I'm going to call that LC34. What does this procedure cover?
That covers the steps taken following for further investigation, as it were, as part of the Hazop process.
And do I understand that that's quite a granular process? A lot of detail is in this work procedure.
Yes.
Finally, can we go to CAD 402997? At the bottom, we can see that the document reference is TPMLC33, and its title is Management Procedure Assessment of Corrosion Damage on Steel Pipework, Supplying Multi-Occupancy High and Medium-Rise Buildings. I'm going to call that LC33. Can you explain what this management procedure covers?
Yeah, this sets out the steps taken to do a further investigation on the rise and network, the steel network, the corrosion
And
assessment.
am I right? Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you.
Sorry.
Please, you finish.
A corrosion assessment.
If severe corrosion is discovered, this procedure would come into play. Is that right?
It would, yes.
Now, taken together, just these four documents, this would set out what gets surveyed when, what survey should be conducted, and what should happen with the information from the survey. Have I summarised that correctly?
Yes.
Now, were these the relevant documents in 2016 and 17?
They were, yes.
And have some of these policies and procedure documents now been superseded?
They have been superseded, yes.
When were they superseded?
In 2019. I think the detail is in some of my exhibits of exactly when the procedures changed.
Yes, I have a note that it's April 2018 and October 2019 for two different
Yeah, the mob,
documents.
they're called the mob series of documents.
Yes, so for the benefit of the record, Exhibit 19 to Mr. Harrison's inquiry witness statement is CAD 403040, and that's the work procedure assessment of corrosion damage on steel pipework supplying multi-occupancy buildings dated April 2018.
Yes.
And Mr. Harrison's exhibit number 20, CAD 403041, is the management procedure for the inspection, maintenance, monitoring and management of supplies to multi-occupancy buildings, and I have that dated as October 2019.
Yes.
Why were these replaced?
We reviewed our procedures in light of some of the events at Grenfell Tower and also moving in industry guidance as well.
Are Caden's policies and procedures monitored by the HSE?
The HSE carry out what they call intervention visits, where they'll come into our organisation and see our policies and procedures in action, as it were.
But not necessarily as a matter of routine.
The intervention visits are routine, but what they look at is not routine.
I see. Am I right that Cadent's policies and procedures, or any gas transporter's policies and procedures, are not typically shared with other gas transporters? They're bespoke and unique to Cadent?
So Cadent owns them, and they're bespoke to Cadent, although we do kind of share through some of our industry groups, our policies and procedures.
Okay. Am I right, though, that the rest of the industry is not obliged to do exactly as Cadent does?
You are, yes.
You don't literally set the standard, as it were?
No.
So that means, I think, that how Cadent manages its compliance would not necessarily apply to, say, a small independent gas transporter.
That's correct. They would have their own procedures.
Right. I'd now like to ask about Cadent's responsibility with an entity called Trio, in high-level terms. Now, was Trio an unincorporated joint venture?
It was, yes.
Do you happen to know between which entities?
Morrison and Skanska.
Did Cadent and Trio enter a contract?
They did, yes.
Do you happen to know when it started?
2013.
Yeah, so what I've got is that the contract was entered on the 18th of December 2012, but it actually started April 2013. Does that sound right?
Yes, that's correct.
And how long was it for?
8 years.
And under that contract, was Trio required to perform services on gas pipelines?
They were, yes.
Was it part of Trio's role to design and construct gas services?
Yes.
And that would include, I think, Grenfell Tower.
Yes.
Was Trio required to comply with statutory requirements?
Yes.
So statutory duties?
Yes.
And what about any obligations put on Caden by the HSC or Ofgem?
Trio would also be expected to apply by those.
And same question about relevant European and British standards.
Yes.
I want to ask first about some regulations called the Construction Design and Management Regulations 2015. Are you familiar broadly with those?
I'm broadly familiar with them.
Can we go to your third inquiry statement at page 14? That's CAD 403043. And at paragraph 45, you say, as Stephen Mason explains in greater detail, Cadent engaged Trio under the Gas Distribution Strategic Partnership contract to provide riser replacement service across all of its networks. Under the CDM Regulations 2015, Cadent was the client in this arrangement, and Trio was the appointed principal designer and principal contractor. In practice, this meant that Trio was responsible for the replacement and connection work from receipt of the work, instruction, through to customer engagement, design, ordering materials, construction, and post-completion data capture. Now, by that, I understand that the contract designated Trio to act as principal designer and also as principal contractor, performing the duties that are required of those roles under the 2015 regulations. Have I summarised that correctly?
Yes, you have.
And Cadent was to fulfil the duties of client, is that right?
Yes, that's right.
Can we now go to HSC 703? This is the Health and Safety Executive's approved code of practice for the CDM Regulations 2015. And if you're not enormously familiar with it, what it does is it sets out the regulations and then provides some guidance on how an entity can comply with those regulations. Can we go to page 14, please? And here we see Regulation 4 set out. And you can see at the top that it deals with client duties relating to managing projects. And at the bottom of this page, we can see Regulation 4.6, and it says this: a client must take reasonable steps to ensure that A, the principal designer complies with any other principal designer duties in Regulations 11 and 12, And over the page, thank you, the principal contractor complies with any other principal contractor duties in regulations 12 to 14. You can take it from me that those regulations 11 to 14 mentioned there set out a variety of duties that the principal designer and principal contractor have to fulfil. Now, having looked at that set out in this code of practice, is it right that Cadent as client would still be required to take reasonable steps to make sure that TRIO fulfilled its CDM duties?
That is correct, yes.
It's not the case, is it, that Cadent can just sit back and let TRIO do whatever they want?
It shouldn't be the case, no.
Now, we've already looked at some HSE guidance about the CDM regulations. Does the HSE also issue guidance specific to the gas industry?
It does, yes.
And would Cadent expect TRIO to comply with those HSE documents?
Yes.
I want to ask you now about another body called IGEM. Do you know what IGEM is?
I do.
As a gas engineer, I thought that's what you would say. Can you tell us what IGEM is?
It's the Institute of Gas Engineers and Managers, and that's effectively the governing body for the gas industry.
The governing body. What sorts of documents does IGEM publish?
They publish engineering standards and engineering documents.
Are those publications very widely used in the gas industry?
Yes.
Would Cadent regard them as authoritative?
Yes.
Would you say that they're the most authoritative statements of technical standards used within the UK gas industry?
I would, yes.
Now, one of the publications you refer to in your statement is IGEM G5. Can we go to that, please, at RHX 705? Thank you. In the top right-hand corner, we can see the code IGEM G5 edition 2. I understand that to be dated 2012. If we look to the middle of the page, we can see the title Gas in Multi-Occupancy Buildings. Do you see that?
I do, yes.
So, taking it from me that this is the 2012 edition, was this publication current in 2016 and 17?
Yes.
Now, the title tells us, again, that it's for multi-occupancy buildings. So, is this publication specifically relevant to the gas installations at Grenfell Tower?
Yes.
And would you expect TRIO to be familiar and follow the technical standards in IGEM G5?
Yes.
Very familiar.
Yes, I would.
Can we go to CLG 50224? This is a document that the panel will be very familiar with. It's approved document B, Volume 2, as amended in 2013. This is issued by the Secretary of State, and it sets out practical guidance on compliance with building regulations. Now, would this be a document that you would expect TRIO to comply with insofar as it was relevant to works on gas risers?
I would expect them to be following that, yes.
Would you expect TRIO to be familiar with all of its contents?
I don't know the document, but I would expect TRIO to be in its role fulfilling work on behalf of Cadent.
Would you say that they should be familiar with those parts relating to gas pipework?
I believe so, yes.
Now, in your experience, would you say that gas engineers tended to look primarily to IGEM publications?
Yes.
And would you say that they tended to assume that if they complied with the IGEM documents, they would comply with all other standards?
From a gas point of view, yes, but there were other documents such as this one here that they would also be expected to comply with.
I follow. I want to turn now to consider Grenfell Tower specifically. And I want to start by asking you about the way gas was supplied to the tower. Can we please go now to CAD 402992? This is your Exhibit 14 to your first inquiry statement. Can we have that blown up, please? Thank you. Now, this is a map which I understand was created after the fire. And it shows in a simplified form how the gas came into the tower And in fact, it's been marked up to show where exactly it was cut off on the day of the 14th of June 2017. And I'm showing you this just to get a bigger picture of the area in a simplified form.
Yeah.
Now, I think the red lines indicate the gas pipes. Is that right?
Those red lines do indicate gas pipes, yes.
But there are a vast number more.
That's what I was going to say.
We may see that later today. But this is a very simple map, just drawn for the purposes of having an understanding.
Yeah.
And the white square in the middle with the orange marker, there's an orange pin in it. Yes, there. I understand that to be Grenfell Tower. Do you understand that as well?
That is correct, yes.
And if we look to the west of the tower, we see Latimer Road Station, tube station, and we can see a red line going from the southwest to the northeast. Do you see that?
I do.
And I understand that to be the main on-station walk. Is that right?
That is correct, yeah.
Yeah. We can see that it comes up and it goes up to sort of the top of the page. Then it turns southeast. Then it runs along the top of the tower, and then it runs north-south down to the east side of the tower. Have I got that correctly so far?
Yes, you have.
And we see some red lines going into the tower from that main, is that right?
Yes.
And if we look to the south of the tower, we can see two other red lines that come up from the south and the southeast. One of them's got the number 2 on it and one of them's got the number 3 on it. And they also join up with that north-south main, is that right?
Yes, those mains are all connected.
Yes. Can we go to the expert report of Mr. Rodney Hancock's at page 14, which is RHX 6012. And here we see at figure 4 a drawing of the basement at Grenfell Tower. And there are 3 services going in, and they're all on the east side. Now, we saw in your simplified map that there was a main on the east side of the tower running north-south. Does that mean that all of the services going into the tower had to come in from the east? There wasn't a lot of choice about that?
All of the services came in from the east.
Were they sort of bound by where the main was, is what I'm getting at?
Yeah, I mean, when the tower was constructed, they would have been bound by the position of our gas pipes, and that would have been the most appropriate route to enter the building.
Right. Now, if you're outside the tower, I think the services come in underground, under the pathway that's outside the tower on the east. Is that right?
That's right, yes.
But is it right that when they go into the basement, they actually enter at a very high height, maybe about 5 metres from the ground? Is that right?
That is right.
Well, we can have a look at some pictures just to visualise that. Can we please go to TRI 7050? This is a marked up photograph by one of the subcontractors to Trio, and it shows the east side of the tower. And we can see that there is some red lines going in, and I think those red lines show the location of the pipes going in. Is that right?
This is right.
Now can we look at TRI 7051? Now this is again a photograph by Trio's subcontractor in the basement, and we can see a yellow pipe at the back there. Is that yellow pipe a gas pipe?
It is.
And it's coming into the basement at high level, isn't it?
It is, yes.
And there's a yellow line that's been drawn on. Is that where the new replacement pipe was to run, as far as you know?
As far as I know, it is, yes.
Can we go to your Exhibit 11 at CAD 402991? Thank you. This is a diagram that you've provided to us showing different types of valves. We can see at the bottom left, right in the bottom left, there's a valve called a PIV. Do you see it?
I do, yes.
Now, above it, there's an access chamber, and there's a label for ground level. What does PIV stand for?
That stands for Pipeline Isolation Valve.
Can you explain what a PIV does?
The purpose of a PIV is to isolate the gas from a building, from outside of the building.
And we see something called an access chamber. Can you explain what an access chamber is?
An access chamber is a chamber that's built around above the valve so that you can get access to the valve in order to open it or to close it.
And when would Cadent typically expect to use a PIV?
In a gas emergency or to isolate the gas from the building.
And should there be PIVs on each of the services into Grenfell Tower, for example?
Yes, there should be.
We'll return to PIVs in due course. Can we go back to figure 4 of Mr. Hancock's report at page 14, RHX 6012? Thank you. Now, at the bottom of this drawing in purple, we see a line labelled the landlord gas supply entry point. I'm going to call that the landlord supply. Can we now go to page 16, figure 6? We see rather a detailed route of how the landlord supply comes through the basement. It's in red at the bottom there. I think we've agreed that it comes in at high level, but does this supply, as far as you know, then drop down to closer to the floor level?
Yeah, I can't remember exactly where in the tower it
Yeah.
does, but yes, it does because it feeds the boiler.
Quite. So that's exactly where I'm going next. It goes, if you trace the line around, all the way around to the top left-hand corner, we see in red new boilers. So it feeds those new boilers. If we look right at the bottom of in the southeast corner, we see there's 2 valves. One is called a low-pressure safety valve, and there's another valve along, and someone's marked it up with the word ECV in black text. Have you found that?
Yes.
Now, if I've understood your evidence correctly, Caden's responsibility for that pipe ends at that ECV. Is that, if that's correct, if that diagram's correct, that that's the ECV, that would be the end of Caden's responsibility for that pipe?
If that diagram's correct, then yes, it would be.
I understand. Now, just to help us understand this supply goes to the boilers. Does that mean that the gas is used to heat water, and then that hot water then travels up to the flats? Have I understood that correctly?
You have, yes.
In other words, this service doesn't provide any live gas into the flats. All of the gas stays in the basement for this service.
That's correct.
Right. Now, just before we leave this supply, can we just have figure 6 back up on the screen, please, if it's not already? Have you got that? You've got
I think we've got that up, haven't we?
Yes, you have that, Mr. Harrison. If we trace that round, we see on the bottom, we see a label saying automatic isolation valve. And can you tell us what an automatic isolation valve would do?
So if there was either an excess flow of gas or no flow of gas into the building, that would isolate automatically.
And this might be an obvious question, but does it do that automatically?
Sorry, I believe so, yeah. I mean, we've got what we call a low-pressure safety valve, which would drop, if the pressure of the gas network dropped, that would turn off, and then automatic isolation valve would be automatically operated.
And could that perhaps be connected to the automatic opening vent system, the smoke control system, for example?
I don't know how the smoke control system works.
But in theory, would that be one way in which an AIV could be operated?
It could be.
I now want to look at the residential supply 1. Can we return to figure 4 on page 14 of Mr. Hancock's report? Now, at the top of this diagram, on the east side, we see a red service pipe marked. I'm going to call it residential supply 1, as I've already indicated. I think that might be a 4-inch screwed steel service. Is that your understanding?
That is my understanding, yes.
And like the landlord supply, it comes in underground and it enters the basement at high level. Is that right?
That is right.
But unlike the landlord supply, it doesn't drop down. It just stays up high in the basement. Is that right?
Yes.
Now, if we follow that red line along in this diagram, we see it goes to 4 corners, 4 compass corners. And it goes into these pale blue boxes, which have variously got the description of riser. Can you explain what happens to the pipework when it goes into those pale blue boxes?
Supply pipe work is horizontal. As it goes into those blue boxes, there would be a 90-degree bend and the pipe would rise vertically.
I see. And can we actually go to your inquiry exhibit number 13, CAD 402993? And you've provided us with some photographs of the pipework and you've marked them up with the word BIV. What does BIV stand for?
And that's a branch isolation valve.
And what does that do?
That is a way of isolating a section of the riser network.
And we see it that variously it's pointing to a yellow wheel. Is that how the BIV is operated?
It is, yeah. You turn that wheel to operate the valve.
When would a Cadent engineer operate a BIV?
For maintenance purposes within the building.
And should BIVs be fitted to branches of a service pipeline?
They should be, yes.
Now, thinking about how the service pipework travelled through Grenfell Tower, we saw that there were the 4 risers, and we can see the 4 BIVs in this picture here. I believe that 2 of those risers, before they got to the older residential flats, they then split in 2 again, making 6 separate risers. Is that right?
Yes.
Now, each floor has 6 flats, so that's 1 riser per each vertical line of flats. Is that right?
Yes.
And as they come up, I believe they go from flat to flat through the floor and ceilings of each flat.
That's correct.
Can we now go to figure 18 on page 26 of Mr. Hancock's report, RHX 6012? And this is a drawing of a typical floor at Grenfell Tower. We can see starting at the top right, we can see flats with numbers ending in 6. And if we go clockwise, flats with numbers ending in 1, flats with numbers ending in 2, and so on. And in each flat, we can see a royal blue box, which is labelled gas riser cupboard, or at least in most of the flats we can see that. If we look specifically at flats with numbers ending in 1 on the east side, have you found that, Mr. Harrison?
Yes.
So we see the gas riser cupboard, and it appears to me to be in a cupboard in the kitchen or living area. And I think this indicates that the gas comes into the cupboards in the flats via the riser. Is that right?
Yes.
Would it then travel to that red box which says gas meter location?
Yeah, there would be a lateral pipe going to that meter location.
Right. And would it then have pipework going to the gas appliances, the cookers?
There would be a ECV, a meter, and then there would be the gas appliances.
I see. And residential supply 1 was just for cooking, wasn't it?
It was, yes.
Can we return, perhaps for one last time, to figure 4 at page 14 of Mr. Hancock's report? We can see in bright green there's a supply called Residential Gas Supply 2. And is this the new service that was installed in 2016 and 17?
It is, yes.
And we can see that it goes straight to the southeast riser. Is that right? If you travel...
Yes, I can see that, yes.
Yeah, so if we take the green line across and then you travel down and then across, it goes up into that blue box, southeast riser. Do you see?
Yes.
Can we go to your inquiry exhibit 11, CAD 402991? Now, this is your diagram with the valves on it. And on the left-hand side, the top valve is called an IIV. Do you see that? Have you found that?
I can see that,
You can see it's pointing to a valve inside the building.
Mm-hmm.
What is an IIV?
That's an inlet isolation valve.
And I've observed that it seems to be inside the building. Would they always be inside the building?
Yes.
As opposed to a PIV, which is outside the building, is that right?
Correct, yes.
Now, we can see a picture of one that was installed at Grenfell Tower in Mr. Hancock's expert report, RHX 6012, page 29. And we see figure 21. Is that an IIV?
It is, yes.
Are they required in multi-occupancy buildings?
Yes.
Now, we saw residential supply 2 has an IIV, but residential supply 1, the older supply, did not. Is that because they weren't required in the 1970s when Grenfell Tower was built?
I believe so, yes. There were regulations in the late 60s, and then there was the regulations in December 72 that did not require that.
Yeah, but they've become a requirement more recently.
They have, yes.
Can we go to Mr. Hancock's report, RHX 6012, at page 31, please? Now, this is a simplified diagram of how residential supply 2 goes through the tower. This diagram is actually taken from Dr. Barbara Lane, but it shows, I think, that the riser went vertically up until the residential floors started. It then turned and entered the protected stairway, and it went up through the stairs. Is that right?
That is correct, yes.
And we can get a sense of that if we go to TRI 60287. And this is a photograph that's been marked up. It's part of the design process. And what we see is a yellow line which demonstrates how the riser was meant to go through the stairs. We can see there'd be a hole in the landing and in the ceiling, and then there'd be yellow lines branching off, and they would be the laterals going off towards the flats. Have I described that correctly?
Yeah, that's a general representation of where the pipes would go.
Yes. Well, let's have a picture of how that would look. It's TRI 501520. Can we have that rotated? Thank you. And I think we can see it might be a little dark. At the bottom, it comes through the floor.
Yes.
It goes up, it goes through the ceiling, and we can see a branch, the black pipe, going from left to right of this picture. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
Yeah. Now, we can get a sense of what it looks like if we go to when it was built on the other side. If we go to RHX 6012, back to Mr. Hancock's report, at page 152. Yes, so the top left picture is the lateral pipe going from the stairs into the lobbies. The top right picture is if you're standing in the lobby, so it comes through the stairs and into the lobby. And the picture beneath those shows how that pipework would travel. From the left, it comes through the stair wall, travels around at the top of the ceiling, all the way around to the flat where it drops down, and on the right hand of the picture you can see where the pipe would have gone into the flats. Is that right? Is that your understanding?
That is, yes.
And to see that as a drawing, can we go to page 26 of this report? And what we can see here, if we can just expand figure 18, the bottom left-hand corner, we can see residential gas supply system 2. Starting at the top of that green line, that's it coming through the stairs. It travels along the stair wall, through the stair wall, and then around the top of the ceiling within the communal lobbies. It then goes into that green box that is now labelled gas meter location. That's a diagram of what we've just seen, isn't it?
Yeah, where it goes through. We haven't seen the gas meter location, but we've seen where it goes through the wall.
We will come to that, yes. There's that gas meter location, I understand, it's there because it was moved from where it had originally been. If you look at the blue box in flats ending in 2, it says redundant gas riser cupboard. Do you see that?
I do, yes.
That, I believe, was the old meter location, and gas meters were moved during works in 2016 and 17. Is that right?
Yes, similar to the other reds and blues, they would have been close to each other.
Yes. When you say they would be close to each other,
Sorry.
you mean the
meter in the riser.
The meter and the riser, yes. And it would be as close to the external wall as possible for access reasons, perhaps.
That would have been the most sensible place to put the meters when the building was constructed.
And there'd be an ECV at the meter?
There would be, yes.
Before the meter?
Before the meter.
Then you have the meter, and then you have some more green pipes coming across inside the flat. And I think they would be installation pipe work going to the gas appliances.
Yes.
The meter was moved. They then have to run some pipes back to where the cookers are. Is that right?
That's correct.
But Caden wouldn't be responsible for those pipelines. That would be a matter for gas safety checks done by the landlord.
And the gas safe engineers.
Right. Now, you've already explained to us about generally what reactive and proactive works are. Can we, in this report, can we go to page 32, please?
Can I just ask you, I'm sorry, I'd quite like to have that previous diagram back. The green line that we can see there seems to take a very circuitous route and doesn't make any use of the redundant gas riser cupboard. Is there any reason that you can see for that?
Yes, the gas riser cupboard would have been constructed when the tower was constructed, and it would have been inaccessible for the replacement pipe work.
Right. Yes, all right, thank you.
Thank you, Sir Martin. We'll certainly be exploring a lot of the detail of that with Mr. Dolan
All right,
tomorrow.
thank you very much.
When we get to page 32, we can see what the riser looked like before it was boxed in. We can see the pipe going around there. And at the end of each pipe, we can see some yellow devices. Do you see those?
I do, yes.
Can you explain what they are?
They're what we call lateral isolation valves or Taylor valves, and we used those to isolate pipes going along those laterals.
And the end of actually, just pausing there, can you tell me how would they be operated?
By turning.
And who would be able to turn those?
Our Cadent engineers or gas safe engineers.
Would the consumer be able to turn these lateral isolation valves?
No, we would not expect the consumer to turn those.
In this picture, we can see it's been marked plugged valve for future extension. Now, was that because this pipework was eventually supposed to serve all of the flats that wanted gas in the building? So all the flats with numbers ending in 1 or 5?
Yeah, so the plan was to do some proactive replacement work for the remaining assets in the building, the other risers in the building. And we call it connected onto, so we would have connected that pipework onto those plugged valves.
So would I be right to say that the work to reinstate gas, as we'll hear, was cut off to flats ending in 2? That work would be called reactive work?
Reactive in the sense that we reacted following our survey, which was proactive, to go and replace the gas pipe.
But you would call the works connecting onto that original riser, you would call that proactive work?
I would, yes.
And that's, perhaps we could call it scheduled activity. Is that fair?
That's fair, yes.
So I've come to a convenient moment for a break.
Well, in that case, we'll have the break.
Thank you very much, sir.
Mr. Harrison, as you were told earlier, we have a break during the morning, and this is a convenient time to take it.
Okay.
So we'll stop now. We'll resume, please, at 11:30. And I have to ask you, please, on this and other occasions, when you leave the room, please don't talk to anyone about your evidence or anything relating to it while you're out of the room.
No, I won't.
All right? Thank you very much. Would you like to go to the usher? She'll look after you. Thank you. Thank you. 11:30 then, please. Okay. Would you ask Mr. Harrison to come back in, please? All right, Mr. Harrison, ready to carry on?
Yes.
Good, thank you. Yes, Mr. Hines.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Harrison, I'm turning now to look at the events that led to residential supply 2 being installed at Grenfell Tower in 2016 and 17. Just to look a little bit at the history of this, had there been a survey of Grenfell Tower, to the best of your knowledge, in 2008?
There had, yes.
And would that have been, again, to the best of your knowledge, part of the 10-year rolling survey programme?
It would have been part of the rolling survey programme, yes.
And was there another attempt to survey Grenfell Tower in 2015?
There was, yes.
Was that completed?
No, we couldn't gain access to the tower.
And was that because of the building works that were ongoing at that time?
I believe so, but I'm not 100% certain.
For the reference of the record, we can see a document about that at CAD 402973, which is the attempted survey in 2015. Now, if there'd been a survey in 2008 and there was one again in 2015, that was only 7 years between, a 7-year interval between surveys. Would that also have been a 10-year survey?
I don't know. I think our approach to the survey frequencies changed around 2006, 2007, which may have had an impact to it being 7 years, but I don't know for sure.
Thank you. In any event, there was a survey in September 2016. To the best of your knowledge, was this survey done as part of Caden's rolling survey programme?
It was done, yes.
In other words, it wasn't an emergency, it was just routine.
No, it was a routine planned survey.
Can we now go to your first inquiry statement at CAD 402985? I just want to remind you about what you say about this survey. At page 7, please, paragraph 26. The engineers spent 1 day surveying the gas assets at the tower. They conducted an external sweep of the building to check for the presence of gas, entered and inspected the basement where the 2 existing gas supplies enter the tower, and also gained access and inspected 51 of the 120 flats within the tower. Now, just pausing there, that means, if my maths is correct, that you surveyed, or Cadent surveyed, about 42.5% of the flats, under half of them. Is that right?
Yes, we got access to to that volume, correct.
Yes. Would that be an average ratio of how many flats you would see in a building of this size?
Actually, that's reasonably high, but yeah.
I see. And the problem, as I understand, you said access.
Correct, yes.
I see. If we just go back to page 20, stay on this page, it's paragraph 27, the next paragraph along. You say, it was during this inspection that a small leak was detected. The engineers reported the leak to the emergency gas leak team and requested the attendance of a repair team to isolate the riser. In accordance with Caden's procedures, the riser where the gas leak was identified was isolated. The gas supply it provided was cut off. One of the engineers stayed on site until Caden's repair team arrived and isolated the riser. This was achieved by closing the branch isolation valve, which is located in the basement of the tower, and cutting and capping the riser to stop the flow of gas. This was done in the early hours of the 1st of October 2016, and the other risers within the tower were unaffected. Now, I understand that small leak was discovered between flats 32 and 22, which I think is floor 6 and 5. Is that right?
Yes.
So just help me visualise that. Was that leak in the floor between the flats, the floor and ceiling between the flats?
Yeah, I believe it was in the concrete, yeah, absolutely, between the floor and the ceiling of the floor and the ceiling of the flat above.
Is that a common phenomenon?
Yeah, I wouldn't have said common, but that is one of the areas where we often get deterioration.
It's something that can happen.
It can happen.
And is that a result of the pipe being within the concrete, or are there other factors at play?
No, not necessarily. There could be a water leak, which would cause a pipe to corrode. Sometimes our pipes get vandalised. That could have caused it to leak.
I see. Unlikely to be vandalised between the floors of flats, so I would have thought.
It's unlikely, but has happened.
I see. Now, you say in your written evidence that the riser was isolated. Would that be the natural result of finding a leak in a building of this size and type?
Yeah, our engineers would attempt to what we call cut out. So you can put a bypass arrangement in past the section and then replace that with a completely new section of pipe. That's one option. If that was, if that wasn't successful, or if we didn't think we could do that, then we would isolate the riser, and then the flats feeding off that would lose their gas supply.
It seems to be quite a difficult thing to do, to put a bypass where the riser goes between floors of flats, though, doesn't it?
It is difficult, which is why, in this occasion, we had to isolate the whole riser.
Why wouldn't Cadent repair the leak?
Because we couldn't get access to do the bypass that we talked about.
Right. There wouldn't be an opportunity to just say, that pipe between those two floors has had a leak. Can we pull that pipe out and put in a fresh one?
Yeah, that would be the bypass.
I see.
We can put equipment around our pipe, but getting access to that was difficult because of the concrete arrangement in the floor.
Right, so it was not access in terms of flat owners, it was access in terms of the concrete.
Sorry, correct, access to our pipe to fix it.
Right. And when it was isolated, I think you've already covered this, but does that have the effect that all of the flats ending in 2 that had been using the gas could no longer use it?
No, yes, you're right, the gas supply was isolated.
Excuse me. Can we now go to the survey that was conducted? That's at CAD 6031, and can we have that in the native format, please? Thank you. Can we start at the first tab, please, which is use? Yes. Now, do you recognise this type of document as being the LC21 survey spreadsheet?
I do, yes.
At least as it was in 2016.
Correct, yes, as it was in 2016.
Thank you. Now, would you personally have been dealing with these sorts of spreadsheets in 2016?
No.
Can I take it, though, that you're broadly familiar with these sorts of surveys, given your written evidence?
I am, yes.
Thank you. Can we go to the tab called, starting with 1, building description? Thank you. And we can see at the top row, row 1, column I, that there's a date on it, and it's the 30th of September 2016. Can we now go to the tab called 3, riser information? Thank you. Have you got that, Mr. Harrison?
I have, yes.
Great. Can we go to column B? We can see a list which says R1, R2, R3, and so forth. Is that a list of the service pipework that goes into residential supply 1, or that was residential supply 1?
Yes, using the terminology you used earlier about supply and service pipework, that would cover that. Albeit we have a riser 1 there, which is actually the horizontal pipe going into the building.
I follow. So this would be an example of a horizontal pipe that's called a riser?
Correct.
I see. The rest of them, though, they're the vertical pipes that go up, as we've described earlier. So the 4 going up and then the split into 6.
Yes.
I see. Can we track across to column K, please? And we can see in column K, it's headed material. Have you found that?
Yes.
And we can see that there's painted steel, and beneath that, the rest of them are bare steel. And in the next column along, column L, we can see a percentage visible. And we see 75 to 100% visible for the top one, so that would be the riser going into the basement. But almost all of the others are 25 to 50%, except for one which is 50 to 75%. Can you explain what percentage visible means?
So that's the percentage of the riser that could be seen by our engineers in order for them to conduct their survey.
And what would it be that would prevent them from seeing the riser?
It could be that the riser is boxed in some areas. It could be that we couldn't get into the flats to see them. But the majority of the cases is where it's boxed in. These risers were built in the fabric of the building, so sometimes getting access to them is problematic.
When you say boxed in, we saw a picture earlier of inside the communal lobbies where there's board boxing them in. Do you mean that sort of boxing in, or do you mean other kinds of boxing in, so it's concreted in?
I mean other kinds of boxing in that it was in a utility shaft or in a shaft within the fabric of the building,
Yeah.
rather than a wooden boxing in that you could remove to inspect.
Because one of the things, and we can go back to it if we need to, one of the things we can observe about the boxing in the communal lobbies is that there's screws, so you can take the wooden or the material off to
Yes.
have a look.
Yes.
Or indeed operate the lateral isolation valve. But you're not talking about that sort of boxing in, are you?
I'm not, no.
You're talking about in the fabric of the building?
I am, yes.
I see. Does that mean that for those pipes, the surveyor couldn't really tell what the condition was?
He couldn't see the pipe and therefore couldn't make an assessment, so yes, you're correct.
Can I just ask, if a pipe is boxed in within the fabric of the building as you described, is the pipe, as it were, free within some void built into the building, or is it actually within the concrete?
No, it's free within a void within the building rather than encased in the concrete.
Right, but you can't get at it because the void is created within a concrete structure.
Yes, a plasterboard. No, the construction material would be around the riser.
Well, plasterboard you could get into. You'd have to break in, though, wouldn't you?
You would, yes.
Yes. Right, thank you.
Or alternatively, there could be an access panel in.
Yes, we do have some with access panels in them.
Now, in the next column, column M, we can see pipe environment. And we see that it's localised dampness. So within what could be visible, am I right, that is the environment that it was in?
Yes, that's correct.
Now, does that present any particular risk, being damp?
Per se, no, but over a period of time, dampness can lead to corrosion of a pipe.
Well, actually, let's just take a step back. What does localised dampness mean specifically?
I think in this example, localised dampness would mean a smaller area of the riser or the pipework that we could see was impacted by the dampness, rather than the running water or a significant amount of dampness within the.
What would the surveyor say if there were a significant amount of dampness or running water? Or
he would make, or she would make reference to water leak or running water or something of that nature.
Right. We saw in one of the columns, column K, that some of the pipes were bare steel and some of the pipes were painted steel. Does the material make any difference to any risks that are in the pipework of buildings?
The material will protect the pipework from levels of corrosion.
And would bare steel, I mean, I'm guessing, but would bare steel be more of a risk factor than painted steel?
Yes, it would.
Right. Can we go to a tab called For Lateral Information? Great. And column B, we can see, has a list of L1 to L6. Now, does that describe the different laterals for each of the different flats going into each of the 6 flats on each floor?
Yeah, we call them lateral groups, so each riser had a lateral group attached to it.
Right. And if we go across to column E, We can see a list of numbers for each of those lateral groups. And on lateral 1, for example, we can see 5 numbers, for example, 56, 86, and so forth. Now, is that a list of the flats that were inspected for that lateral group?
I believe so.
Perhaps if you look at column D, it might help, because column D says number of laterals in the group which have been surveyed. We see 5. Then we go to column E, and it says flat dwelling numbers, and we see a list of numbers. Does that indicate to you, and it's perfectly acceptable if you're not sure to say so, but does that indicate to you that those were the flats that were inspected?
It indicates that to me, yes. But I've just summed up the numbers in D, and I didn't get to 51.
So you've added up the numbers in D and you get to 51.
I didn't know.
You didn't know.
My maths might have been poor.
I haven't. I think it might be, but
Okay.
But yes. So if that's right, those would be the flats
Yes,
that were surveyed.
correct. Yeah.
Right. If we track across to column M, can we have the screen where so column M is slightly more in the centre? Thank you. We can see in that first row, it's a little obscured, but it says, if laterals are made of steel. Have you found that?
I have, yes.
Great. And in column O, we can see corrosion level. And it says some of them are superficial, but we can see 2 of them have severe corrosion. Now, can you just explain what severe corrosion is?
We have 3 different levels of corrosion, moderate, severe, or extreme. And severe corrosion is a measure of corrosion which may or could infect the integrity of the pipe.
We saw the word superficial. Do I understand on that? You said there's only 3, but in reality perhaps there's 4 because there's superficial.
Yeah, I think I cover this in my statement.
Of course.
But yes, superficial would be superficial. It wouldn't have any impact on the
Yes.
integrity of the asset.
So when you say that there are 3 levels of corrosion, would it be right to say there's 3 levels that Caden would pay attention to or pay particular attention to, starting with moderate?
I would, yes.
And am I right, though, that the surveyor can really only describe the corrosion level of the pipework that they've seen? Is that fair?
That is fair, that's correct.
If we look across to column P, we can see there are 2 locations where corrosion has been identified, and the numbers 52 and 165. I suggest that those are the flat numbers where corrosion has been found on the laterals. Is that right?
Yes.
Can we look at column U now? Row 9. We can see, have you found it? We can see gas leak location. And we see there listed where that leak had been found, 22 and 32 between the flats. Do you see that?
I do, yes.
Great. Can we now go to a tab called 5 IGEM and CDM compliance? And we can see here a list of questions. Can I draw your attention to the question on row 5, which is, do all steel vertical pipes have supports at least once every 2.5 metres? And the answer is no. And then can we look at question 10, which is, does any network pipeline pass through an individual dwelling other than the one it supplies? And the answer is yes. Question 15, it says, are all risers laterals within a space that has adequate natural ventilation? Answer is no. Question on row 16, are all risers laterals sleeved where they pass through a structural element, wall, floor? No. Question on row 19, Are there any features of the building that are causing damage or deterioration of the NGG's assets? Answer, yes. Just pausing there. Can you tell us what NGG stands for?
That would be National Grid Gas.
Right. And finally, just draw your attention to question 20. Have any internal lengths been greater than 2 metres? Have any internal lengths greater than 2 metres been found? Answer, yes. Actually, just one last one. Question 21. Are flexible connectors used within the lateral to accommodate thermal expansion movement of the riser? Answer, no. Just looking back at question 16, we saw the word sleeved. Can you explain what sleeving is?
Yeah, in some of the younger assets, we have a riser pipe is sleeved as it goes through the flooring of a dwelling. So that would mean that there's effectively movement, space for the pipe to move around within that section.
So if I've got it right, you have the pipe, say it's of steel.
Yes.
Then there's a donut-shaped hole, and then there's like another pipe around it, a sleeve around it. Is that right?
Yes.
And there's space between.
There's space.
Please no.
Yeah, there's space between our gas riser and the concrete floor.
Yes.
And that would be the sleeve, and there would be a sleeve within there.
And the sleeve touches the concrete floor.
Yes.
Yes. And the pipe can move about a bit in the sleeve. Is that
It could
a little bit?
A little bit.
Yeah. Now, just looking at the title, coming back to this document, it says IGEM compliance. Now, these questions might appear to be about whether this installation complied with IGEM at the time of the survey. Mm-hmm. Is that right?
I believe did this riser comply with IGEM G5 at the time of the survey?
IGEM G5 2012.
Yes.
Yeah. Now, would any of those features, the ones I've read out or anything else you can see on that part of the page, would any of those features give Cadent cause for concern about this riser or with this system?
So I think we'd recognise that the riser was constructed before the current period of G5. These answers then go into a priority score, which would then determine how frequently we would go back to the riser. Some of the questions about the localised dampness would prompted us to plan in a proactive replacement of the remaining assets in the building.
Right. In fact, we can see the priority score if we go to Input Summary tab. It's to the right of tab 6. Yes, that's it. And at cell 10B, at the top left of the screen there, we can see total building priority score, 596,026. Do you see that?
I do, yes.
Now, I think we said earlier that any score above 210,000 would trigger surveys to be taken to the Hazop meeting, is that right?
Yes.
And perhaps as a result of that, there might be more frequent surveys. Is that correct as well?
It would be, yeah. So the risk score changed when the laterals and the riser was isolated, but we still process these through the Hazop to see what else we would need to do at the building.
Right. Was 596,000 a particularly high score?
I wouldn't say that was particularly high, but it's high enough to kick it into our Hazop process and for the building to be put onto an annual survey frequency.
Right. In fact, let's have a look at what you say about that. Can we go to CAD 402985? This is your first inquiry statement. And can we go to page 8, please? Paragraph 31. Thank you. Now, you say here, a combination of factors contributed to this priority score, including and most significantly, the small gas leak that was identified in the concrete screed between flats 22 and 23. Just pausing there, I think you may mean 32. I think that's a little slip.
Yes.
The inability to visually identify PIVs on the supply pipes and the corrosion identified in the laterals. As explained above, as a result of the gas leak, the riser was isolated on the 1st of October 2016. Had another LC21 survey been undertaken on the 1st of October 2016, therefore, the priority score would have been significantly reduced in light of the fact that the riser had been isolated. So I take it from that once the riser was cut and capped to the flats ending in 2, that would automatically lower the building priority score. And I think you've said that in your evidence already.
Yes.
Now, that means that, or does that mean that Caden therefore doesn't have to survey this building more frequently?
It could do. So the building was, if I may, the building was surveyed in 2015. Because we couldn't get access, it had a very high score,
Right.
which was 999,000, which was then an annual survey. So I believe that after those laterals and the rise was isolated, it would have gone into a 5-yearly cycle. But I'd need to refer to more notes and more information.
Of course, just as a matter of general Cadent approach to these sorts of issues. If that had happened, does that mean that Cadent then doesn't take any further action? It would just surely not cut that riser and leave it there?
No, we would cut that riser, replace that riser, and then pick up on the other elements that we identified during the survey.
And is that what you would do at the Hazop meeting process?
It is, yes.
Right, and we've seen that in residential supply 1, we've seen 2 instances of severe corrosion, and we've seen some questions from the IGEM G5 principles, perhaps answered not favourably. Would that indicate to Cadent that the ongoing use of residential supply 1 might be in question?
It wouldn't suggest that. It would suggest that we would either go back and routinely survey that riser every year, or alternatively, given we were in the riser in the building anyway, we would take proactive steps to replace the other risers.
So, using Grenfell Tower as an example, because there'd been a cutting and capping of one line of flats, Cadent then took that opportunity to then proactively replace all of the others. Is that
yes?
right?
That is what we would normally do.
I see. Can we go now to CAD 6019? I'm turning now to look at some of the events around that cutting and capping isolation and what happened next, really. This is an email from Danny Large, and we can see at the bottom of the page that he worked for National Grid. And this email at the top we can see is dated 3rd of October 2016. So it's a few days after the LC21 survey of 30th of September. Is that right?
It is, yes.
Now, there's an attachment we can see there, and it says disconnected MOB, and it appears in its file name to refer to Grenfell Tower. And at the bottom, you can see that Mr. Large has said, Trio have met with NG on site to confirm project scope. Now, is NG National Grid?
It is, yes.
And do I understand correctly from this that by the 3rd of October, so within a few days, Trio had been to Grenfell Tower and had met Cadent, and there'd been a discussion about the work that Trio would do?
That is correct.
Would you describe Trio's work at Grenfell urgent work?
I would, yes.
And why was that?
Because we had customers without gas.
Does Cadent have to pay customers who are cut off from gas?
Yes, through our regulatory kind of regime or contract, we pay compensation to customers if their gas supply is isolated.
Would you say that Cadent is incentivized to restore gas to consumers as soon as possible?
At the time of the fire, we had a daily payment that we had to make to customers. I believe it was capped at 1 month. So I wouldn't have used the word incentivized for a month. It's just part of our regulatory contract for us to do that.
In any event, we saw that there'd been very swift action a matter of days before Trio and Cadent met on the site.
Yes. May I come in? The compensation is more to provide our customers with money rather than to penalise Cadent.
I see. But in any event, would you agree that swift action was taken by
yes.
Cadent? And would I be fair to characterise that as being because customers were off gas?
Yes, you would.
I see. Can we go to the PDF form of a document code TRI 501768? When this comes up, this will be the attachment. Page 2 of it will be the attachment to this email from Mr. Large. Thank you. We can see at the top of this document, you can take it from me that this is a PDF version of the spreadsheet that Mr. Large sent. I hope we can make that out. There's a green box, as it's called the riser request pro forma, and there's a green box under it. I'm not sure if we can read it, but I'll read out what I think it says. I think we've got a clearer version coming up now. Thank you, that's much clearer. Under that, this green box says, this document is classed as the client brief and supports the ongoing compliance to the Construction, Design and Management Regulations 2015. The information contained in this document has been prepared to the best of knowledge of the client and in accordance with Regulation 4.4. Now, just to clarify again, I think you agreed with me that Caden was the client under the CDM regulations. Now, below that, in the box, the green box below that, on the left-hand side, we can see the date of that document, 1st of October 2016, and we can see the time of cut-off, which I think is 2 a.m. Is that your understanding?
It's my understanding that it was cut off in the early hours of the morning, so that would be correct. Yeah.
Right. And if we scroll midway down to the page, we can see supply materials on the left-hand side, and we can see in the yellow box the words supply material steel, supply diameter 4 inches, and so forth. Have you found that?
I have, yes.
And I think that's a description of the pipework that had been cut off.
It is, yes.
Thank you. Now, beneath that, we see height of building. We see that it's over 40 metres, and the category of job is high-rise. Do you see that?
I do, yes.
So is this some information about the tower itself?
It is, yes.
Now, beneath that, we can see a big list of flat numbers of people who were at the time believed to have been cut off. Can you see that list?
I can, yes.
Yeah. If we look down, just to clarify something, we see something on the second line of that. It says flat number 201. But I believe that flats ending in 1 were not actually cut off, were they?
They weren't, no.
So it's just a slip on this form?
I think that's an error on the form when they were completing it that night, morning.
Yes, indeed. And if we look at the fourth column along, it's entitled Vulnerability Identified, we can see that there's a few unknowns, but then there's a few that have got some confirmed vulnerabilities. Do you see that? I
do, yes.
And if we go all the way and look at the far right-hand column, we can see what appliances the residents used. And in every case, it's cooking and a hot plate. Is that right?
That's correct, yes.
And if we go right to the bottom, you can see additional comments. 181, 171, customers do not use gas. Do you see that?
I do, yes.
Yeah. Was this a document that Cadent would routinely fill in order to brief Trio for works done on the replacement gas risers?
It is, yes. This would start off the kind of the handover or setting Trio to work.
Right. Well, that's what I want to ask you about next, actually. So we saw that the riser request pro forma was stated to be in accordance with Regulation 4.4 of the CDM regulations. Can we just have a quick look at that? It's at INQ 30-11316. Thank you, and it's at page 5, please. And Regulation 4.4 says a client must provide pre-construction information as soon as is practicable to every designer and contractor appointed or being considered for appointment to the project. My question is, as a matter of practice, was the riser request pro forma Cadent's way of providing pre-instruction information under the CDM regulations?
Yeah, so that started off the kind of that design and construction phase.
Yeah.
We also had Trio employees working in our offices, and they had access to all of our gas pipe material, our maps as well. So they had other information available to them.
Right. But before we get to that, and we will,
Yeah.
one of the experts to this inquiry, Dr. Barbara Lane, has said that the riser request pro forma was not on its own sufficient to serve as pre-construction information for the purposes of CDM Regulations 2015. And I think you've answered this question, really, but would Cadent have expected Trio to supplement this information handed over with further information that it gathered?
Yes, we would have.
And are you aware if Trio did in fact supplement this information before commencing any construction works?
I believe they would have done, yes, because they needed to know where the gas pipes were that fed to the tower.
Right. And to what extent would Trio be expected to engage with the building owner, so for example, the TMO, in gathering that sort of information?
So I guess Cadent would have been expected to provide some information for the pre-construction information. But once the construction and the design work had started, we would also expect Trio to liaise with the TMO and other people that would operate within the building.
Right. So even if these works are urgent because you had customers off gas, would you agree that it's important to gather proper and complete information before any construction is started?
I agree that you would need to have full information, or as much information as you could, before construction would start it, yeah.
And that has to be done early in the project under the CDM regulations, doesn't it?
I'm not an expert on CDM, but I believe it does say that, yes.
Right. There's just one other point I want to ask you about with regards to the CDM regulations while we're here, and it's about F10 notification. Do you know what I mean by F10 notification?
Yes, that's the notification to the HSE.
And when do you give notification to the HSE?
For construction works like this.
Yeah, so if it's over, say, 30 days, you would notify HSE. Now, Mr. Mason has said in his second inquiry statement that a project-specific F10 doesn't appear to have been submitted to the HSE for the Grenfell Tower works. As far as you know, should notice have been submitted to the HSE for these works?
Yes, it should have.
Do you accept that that was Cadent's duty as client to give that notice?
I believe it was, yes.
I want to talk now about buyout. Now, we've seen that there was an almost immediate instruction, or certainly an initial contact with Trio in the first few days. But at the same time, I understand there were conversations about buying out the gas through October and November 2016. Can you explain to us what buying out gas means?
Yes, sometimes when we have to isolate buildings, the customers don't want to have gas in there, or we don't think we can get gas put back into the building. So we would enter into an arrangement with the customers to see whether they wanted to, in fact, have a payment made for the gas to be removed from their properties.
Now, Would Cadent, for a building like this, would Cadent always consider buying out the gas?
Not always. I mean, if we could design and have a new riser put back into the building, then we would do that because we have a number of customers within the building, and obviously, as Section 10 requirements through the Gas Act as well would present us to get gas back into the building.
When you say Section 10, just to be clear, that's when you're talking about the 23 metre, the duty to connect at 23 metres horizontally. Is that right?
That's correct, yes.
Right. Now, you've mentioned customers. When you say customers, in this situation, we have the TMO and we have a number of individual gas consumers in each of the flats. Who exactly do you mean by customers?
When I talk about customers, I mean the people in the individual flats.
Right, right. Can we go to Stephen Mason's statement, CAD 403005, page 7. And it's paragraph 22 that I'm looking at. And he says, following the isolation of riser 2, there were two options in respect of that element of the gas supply at the tower. One option was to no longer supply gas for cooking to the building and compensate or buy out all gas customers within the building for this. This compensation would enable customers to swap to electrical appliances for cooking purposes. This option was only considered viable if all consumers using gas within the tower agreed to the change, not just those served by riser 2, and the owner or tenant management organisation, if we can go over the page, or TMO, agreed to it. Caden's experience has been that it is very challenging and time-consuming to obtain universal agreement, and was also mindful that whilst this issue was being discussed with the customers supplied by the isolated riser 2 would remain off gas without a gas supply for cooking. So as far as you are aware, is that the policy, or at least the usual approach of Cadent?
That was the usual approach, yes.
Can we, just staying on page 8 there, can we look at paragraph 23, where Mr. Mason says, throughout October and November 2016, the potential for a buyout was the subject of ongoing discussions with the Kensington and Chelsea Tenants Management Organisation, KCTMO, which manages the tower. It was concluded by Cadent in November 2016 that a buyout was unachievable, as it was unlikely that the required agreement of all gas users in the tower would be obtained, as the majority of them still use their gas supply. Is that your understanding? That's Steve Mason's evidence. Is that your understanding of what happened?
That's my understanding. Steve was in charge of that operation at the time, so I believe that would be the most accurate account.
I understand. I just want to ask about the decision-making process of buying out specifically. Can we go to CAD 6048? Now, and maybe an error at the top. I'm expecting an email. Yes, this is correct. Now, in the last paragraph here, this is an email from Mr. Kelly. I believe he's a Cadent employee, is that right?
He was.
And he's written to Mr. Smith, and I believe he was from Trio. Is that your understanding?
That is my understanding, yes.
Now, in the last paragraph, he says, with regard to the buyout, it will be difficult to present any figures to the TMO as National Grid or Cadent has not seen any costing to assist in understanding the commercial viability. Can we now go to, before I ask you a question on that, can we now go and see CAD 6058? The second email down, we can see it starts on 16th of November, yes, timed 1912, is from Mary Ryan. And I understand Mary Ryan was an employee of Cadent.
Correct.
And she's written to the TMO, you can take that from me, and she says, from the second paragraph down, with reference to your first point on compensation, all gas users will be entitled to the, to the maximum guaranteed standard of services compensation of £1,500. Please accept my apologies for not receiving any firm information from TRIO to date on either a resolution or buyout proposal. The decision on whether a buyout is a viable solution, rests with myself on behalf of National Grid, based on the cost of replacement versus compensation to gas users. Is there any information you could share on confirmed gas users within the building to expedite this option? And just for completeness, can we scroll to the very top? And we can see that Mr. Kelly has written and corrected her on the amount of compensation, which I think she's gotten incorrectly, and it's £1,000, not 1,500. But really dealing with the substance of those two emails, is Ms. Ryan correct that the decision whether to buy out or not rests with Cadent and Cadent alone?
So the decision whether to buy out would be a Cadent decision, but we would base that decision on information we had from the TMO in terms of the number of gas users, and also TRIO on the design of the riser.
Right. Well, we'll come on to TRIO and their design, but she said that this was based on the cost of replacement versus the cost of compensation. Can you tell us, how does cost feature in the decision-making process?
There's the cost to replace the riser, but to my mind, the cost to replace the riser would far outweigh the compensation there. So I don't think it is a cost decision. I think it's a decision on can we get gas restored back into that building.
Right, so, but does Caden do that exercise, how much it's going to cost to replace versus how much the compensation would be, and base any of its decision on cost?
No, I don't think we do.
So has perhaps Ms. Ryan's misspoke there?
I don't know about misspoken, but I think obviously that was the email that she wrote, and that was a decision that she made, or a process that she felt were appropriate at the time. I can't comment further on the words that she's
of
put
course.
there.
No, I'm certainly not asking you to get into Ms. Ryan's mind, but we can also see that Mr. Kelly mentioned commercial viability. I'd really want to know what commercial viability is Cadent concerned with when thinking about buyout.
So I don't know what Mr. Kelly was thinking. I believe he would have been thinking, or suspect he would have been thinking, what's the cost to replace the riser versus the cost that we would be paying to the customers in compensation.
And am I right, listening to your evidence, that that's not a predominant factor in Cadent's decision-making on buying out gas?
It's a factor, but it's not a predominant factor. The overriding predominant factor is whether we can restore the gas supply in accordance with our current standards.
Okay. Can we go to CAD 6059?
Sorry, could you help me just with one question before we move on too far? We saw from one of the earlier documents that Caden approached this on the basis if you buy out the whole building or not at all. Why is it not possible to buy out part of the building which is served by the riser you'd capped?
It would have been possible, but Cadent would want to remove all of the assets from the building so that we didn't have to carry on surveying it and keep on visiting that.
Why would you need to do that if you'd capped the riser? You couldn't have any gas leaks, and What would be the point?
Well, with the other 5 risers, we would need to continue to maintain
Oh, you need to do that.
those. Yes, yeah. So we could have, you could buy out the riser that fed the customers that were cut off, but we would still have to go and maintain the other risers and laterals within that building.
And that would make it uneconomic?
I wouldn't have said uneconomic. It's sort of impractical, really, from a survey and asset point of view, in that we would still have to periodically go back to that building to maintain it.
Yeah. All right. Thank you very much.
Is there any suggestion, Mr. Harrison, that these pipes where they had some severe corrosion identified and there was some natural ventilation problems, is there any suggestion that it just would have been better to decommission the rest of residential supply 1? Would that have featured in Caden's thinking?
Can you ask the question again?
Yes, I'm really just trying to develop Mr. Chairman's point, but would it have been... We saw in the survey there were a number of IGEM G5 questions, including, for example, that there was some difficulties or challenges with natural ventilation. There was the lack of sleeving. Those are the sorts of technical requirements I understand to be in the current edition of IGEM G5. When Cadent was thinking about what to do with Grenfell Tower, would it have featured in anyone's minds that this is a building where we've identified some severe corrosion, we've got difficult to access pipes, really we're looking to decommission all of it and either buy out or replace all of it with a new pipeline?
Yeah, I think people considered the proactive replacement work. That was our intention, to proactively replace the other risers and laterals in the building.
And would you say that was an immediate instinct or an immediate decision? Would Cadent look at this building and say, look, there's lots of difficulties with these pipes being in people's flats, and immediately start thinking we need to replace or we need to decommission residential supply 1 and buy it out?
I don't think we would consider we need to decommission it. I think we would go down the steps that we took to plan the replacement of the other gas risers and laterals in the building.
But once residential supply 2, the new riser, was built, that would mean residential supply 1 would be completely replaced, though, wouldn't it? Decommissioned. There'd be no point of keeping those pipes anymore.
So once the riser that we cut off was replaced, that would restore the gas supply to the 13 properties that had their gas supply isolated. The other remaining properties would continue to be fed from the gas supply that was built when the tower was constructed. We would then arrange to have their supplies transferred onto the newly constructed gas pipe. That was our intention.
And then once those proactive works were done, then there'd be no need for the old 1970s pipes anymore.
No, we would cut those off.
Yeah, so decommission those. Once everyone had gas via the new pipe, the old pipes would have no purpose. They'd be redundant.
Correct.
Yeah, I presume Cadent would make them safe and not ever use them again. Is that right?
They would cut and cap those pipes, and we would have a new riser installed in the building that would be providing gas to all of the gas users in that building.
Right, and once that was done, there'd be no need to survey those old pipes again. That would just be, I don't know how you'd put it, perhaps you say dead supply.
Correct. We would either remove them or isolate them, fill them with inert material, and they would never need to survey them from carrying gas point of view.
Very well. In fact, can we go to a document that perhaps Mr. Chairman was thinking about, and it's CAD 6059. And at the bottom of page 1, we see an email on the 17th of November, timed 1419, and there it is. And this is again from Ms. Ryan to Martin Wiskin, and I understand he's a TRIO employee. Is that your understanding?
Yes, it is.
Yes. And she says, unfortunately, your colleagues have been stating that this is a buyout location to the local authority and NG, National Grid, for approximately the last month. You are correct, we will only buy out a whole building, not a single riser, etc. And if we scroll up to the top of the page, Martin Wiskin's written an email, and I believe that this is internally within Trio. He says, I've just had confirmation back from Mary that NG will not go for buyout. Please see below. So, as at the 17th of November 2016, was that a final decision from Cadent on this matter?
I'm sorry, I don't know. Looking at this email, that appears to be a decision, but I don't know what else was considered at the time.
Very well. Just, I guess, taking a step back about how Cadent would approach this, in this situation, if there'd already been a decision that all of the users would eventually be supplied by the new riser, was it not a little illogical to say that we'd only buy out if the entire building is off gas?
I don't think so. I think this was more the point of, do we get gas back into the building or not? So I think we progressed down the buyout route initially, and then realised that we could get a compliant riser designed and built, and therefore went down the route of connecting the other customers who weren't cut off onto the new riser.
Do I understand from that there was a question of urgency of getting the consumers off gas back on gas?
I think there was a need to make a decision whether we would restore gas to those customers or whether we would buy them out and the other gas users out within the building.
And would it be right that from this point, if that, you say there's a need to make a decision, if from that point of decision, whenever it was, if it was here or at another time, was the option of buyout then just effectively off the table?
From reading some of these emails, I believe it was, yes.
Well, in fact, Trio went on to finalise the design, as you've already alluded to. Was there any step in Cadent's process which allowed an evaluation of that design against the option of buyout at a later date? By that I mean, once Trio had finalised their design, was there a step in the process where it would be compared with buyout as an alternative?
No. This decision here would have been the final one if this was the decision here. If Trio had come back and said, look, we can't restore the gas supply into Grenfell Tower, then we would have reopened those discussions about a buyout.
In that case, if Trio had said, we can't do this in a safe and compliant way, would that not mean that Cadent would have no choice but to buy out?
Yes, it would.
Right. And in those situations, I suppose, I mean, you tell me, but I suppose it's less up to the consumer deciding. It's Cadent saying, we can't do this in a safe and compliant way, and this has to be the option taken. Is that fair?
Yes, it is fair.
In the case of Grenfell Tower...
Sorry to keep interrupting you, but I may not be the only one who's curious to know the answer to this question. You must have had some idea what it was going to cost to have Trio replace all these internal pipeworks. From Cadent's point of view, why wasn't it simply a question of, is it going to cost us more to replace the pipework or buy out the building? I mean, what other factors were in play?
It would be the customer's right to have gas the Gas Act, the Section 10(1) within 23 metres. If later down, at a later date, somebody wanted to have gas supply, then and we had a design that was compliant, then we would need to connect those customers.
Yeah, I understand. Very well, thank you.
Well, actually, let's have a look at the Gas Act so we can understand exactly what you're saying. Can we go to INQ 14770? And I'm looking at page 53, please. In fact, page 52, I'm sorry. And we can see section 10 there, duty to connect certain premises. And section 10 says that. Subsection 1 says, subsection 2 below applies to any premises in an authorised area of a gas transporter which A, are situated within 23 metres from a relevant main of the transporter, or I'll skip over B and go straight to subsection 2, subject to the provisions of this part and any regulations made under those provisions, a gas transporter shall, on being required to do so by the owner or occupier of any premises to which this subsection applies, and there are some provisions there. A, in the case of premises falling within paragraph A of subsection 1, connect the premises to the relevant main and supply and lay pipe that may be necessary for the purpose, for that purpose. Now, is that what we might colloquially call the 23-metre rule?
Yes.
I realise you're not a lawyer, Mr. Harrison, and that was quite a baffling onslaught of statutory provision there. But that from a simple reading, if we could make a simple reading of that, is the duty that you refer to.
It is, yes.
And perhaps we could draw attention to the word shall in subsection 2 on being required to do so by the owner and occupier of premises. And is that what you were getting at when you were answering the chairman's question?
Yes.
Right. Can we just go down to subsection 9, which is on page 53? And that says, notwithstanding, nothing in subsection 2 or 3 above shall be taken as requiring a gas transporter to connect or to maintain the connection of any premises if, and can I draw your attention to B, circumstances exist by reason of which his doing so would or might involve danger to the public, and he has taken all such steps as it would be reasonable to take, both to prevent the circumstances from occurring and to prevent them from having that effect. Now, as I read that, I think the effect of it might be that if there's not a safe route for gas, Cadent would be excused its duty of connecting the gas. Would that be your understanding?
Yes, it would.
And do I understand correctly that if a safety concern were flagged, say by Trio, would Cadent be able to change its decision on buying out the gas, even though not all customers agreed, or it didn't make financial sense, or there was only one riser cut off at the time?
Yeah, so going back to my comment earlier about a design that complied with G5, I believe that would constitute, if we could not design it to those regulations, then we would not be putting gas back into the building.
Right. Now, in this case, the case of Grenfell Tower, Cadent told Trio there was no possibility for buyout. Does that not put Trio in the position of having to find a route or fail to assist Cadent meeting its duty to connect?
We would expect Trio to find a compliant route. If they couldn't, then we would expect them to tell us.
As far as you're aware, did Trio ever raise any concerns about the safety and compliance of the route that they were proposing?
Not as far as I'm aware, no.
Did Trio ever ask for the decision on buyout to be reconsidered by Cadent?
I don't know.
Just thinking about the TMO, could the TMO have refused to allow the riser replacement works to go ahead and insisted that Cadent buy out the gas?
I don't know where they would stand legally because the TMO, I don't think, is the building owner.
Very well. Let's put it this way. Would the building owner, whoever that may be, would the building owner be able to step in and say to Cadent, we would prefer you to buy out?
I don't know, because it also becomes an arrangement with the specific customers as well.
Right. Do I understand that from that your focus, or Cadent's focus, would primarily be on the consumers in the flats of gas?
I wouldn't say primary focus, but they're the people that we distribute the gas to, so they would be expecting to maintain that gas supply.
Yeah. And that means, I think, that if they say, we want gas, or we in this flat want gas, and there is a safe, let's say the safe and compliant way of getting the gas up the stairs, as it were, then Cadent would take that, the consumer, as being the say-so on that connection.
Yes.
Not, for example, the building managers or the building owners.
There would the building owners as well, but not the building managers. The people that own the building and own the dwellings would be the ones that we would liaise with. But
Right.
Predominantly, it would be the customers whose gas supply had been cut off.
I understand. What input would Cadent typically have in designing a replacement riser?
We wouldn't have any input. We would we employed Trio as the principal designer, and we would hand across the project to Trio and expect them to design a riser.
Does Cadent sign off Trio's designs at all?
No.
Now, Mr. Dolan from Trio will give evidence tomorrow to the inquiry, and he tells us in his witness statement something. If we can go to it, it's TRI 401797 at page 7, paragraph 28. At paragraph 28 at the bottom of the page, he says, fire safety was considered by Trio at an early stage, and discussions took place in October and November 2016 between Trio, KCTMO and Cadent regarding whether the proposed route for the gas riser pipe was acceptable and compliant with the fire management precautions in place at the tower. Now, to the best of your knowledge, was Cadent involved in discussions about the riser in November 2016?
I believe that those parties mentioned, Trio, KCTMO and Cadent, kind of consulted on what route the riser would go, but the responsibility fell onto Trio to design that riser.
As far as you know, were those discussions about the fire management precautions in the tower?
As far as I know, yes. Reading that statement there, that's what I believe to be the case.
Very well. Now, one of the things we'll hear a lot about tomorrow, not so much for today, but tomorrow we'll hear about the design changed in March 2017. Would it be correct to say that Cadent was consulted on those changes as well?
I believe they were, yes.
Can we go to Mr. Mason's second statement to the inquiry at CAD 403044? Can we go to page 8, please? Paragraph 32. Now, I appreciate this is Mr. Mason's evidence. I'd just like your view on what he says. He says, Cadent remained informed where the nature of the design had changed and what, if any, impact this may have upon the performance of the contract. However, Cadent had no direct involvement in the design revision, and indeed would not have the experience or expertise to deal with any design decisions Trio made as principal designer. This was a matter of Trio performing its role under the contract. Over the page. Now, is it right that Cadent wouldn't have the experience or expertise to consider Trio's design decisions at Grenfell?
No, the nature of the contract that we had with Trio was all contracted to them. We had nobody within National Grid, as was then, who had the experience or the expertise to act as the designer.
So no one at National Grid would have been able to review the design and against IGEM G5, for example?
We didn't have that expertise, no.
I see. Well, going a little further into the narrative, turning to December 2016, we've already spoken about what a Hazop risk assessment meeting is, and I understand that the first one that considered Grenfell Tower was on the 5th of December 2016. Does that sound right to you?
It does, yes.
And who attends Hazop meetings?
We have the local engineering team that was based in London, the supervisor that managed the work in Bob's, and we also had members of our central network strategy team as well.
What does the central network strategy team do?
At the time, they kind of coordinated a lot of the Hazop meetings, and they kind of held the data on what actions were taking place.
Right.
They sort of chaired and facilitated those meetings.
Okay. How often are Hazop meetings?
Generally, as needed, but normally once a month or so. You'll see that in the Hazop meetings that we have, we talked about a number, or the team then talked about a number of different buildings in that one meeting.
Yes, we'll go to that in a minute.
Okay.
We'll see that to the extent we can. If they're once a month, the survey was completed at the very beginning of October.
Yeah, I believe they're once a month. I haven't checked recently how often they are.
Sure, but we've got a period of all of October, all of November, and then this meeting happens on the 5th of December. So there's a period of 2 months before this meeting.
Yes, I think our procedures say a Hazop meeting must be held within 3 months.
Yes, exactly, yes. But, and this falls within that 3 months.
Yes.
But is there any reason why, what I'm trying to get to the bottom of is are they at 3 month intervals, or are they more common?
I don't know what they were at this time.
Okay. And at these meetings, Caden, I think you say consider a number of actions for buildings. Are all of the buildings on that list buildings that would score over 210,000 on the building priority score?
I believe all buildings over 210,000 will be on there. That there may also be others on there as well that score below that level. Right.
Okay. Now, before we go to the Hazop minutes themselves, I just want to go back to the LC21 survey to just remind ourselves of something that it said. And it's the native version of CAD 6031. And I need the tab called Input Summary. Great, thank you. In red towards the top of the page there, we see immediate action notes. And we see laterals L3, L6 have severe corrosion. Please investigate. Supply pipes S1, S2 have no PIV. Please investigate. Do you see that there?
I do, yes.
Yeah. And references to S1 and S2, would they be to what I've called the landlord supply and the residential supply?
They would be, yes.
They would be the only two pipes at the time of this survey, September 2016. They would be the only two pipes into Grenfell at that time.
Correct, yes.
Do you agree that, looking at that red text there, that the LC21 survey clearly identified that PIVs could not be found on the two existing gas supplies at the tower in 2016?
Yeah, reading that text there, that says that when they surveyed it, they couldn't find the PIVs and we needed to go and do further work.
Right. Can we go to your first inquiry statement at page 22? That's CAD 402985. Can we go to page 22? Yes. And can we go to paragraph 82, please? And you tell us this. It's a common occurrence for PIVs to be covered over or otherwise rendered inaccessible by building owners or contractors undertaking work on their behalf. This occurs without liaison or notification to the relevant gas distribution network. We can go over the page. Gas distribution network operators. With this in mind, our surveys require us to state whether PIVs can be visually identified at the premises surveyed. Can I take it from that it was known at Cadent that PIVs were covered over from time to time?
Yes, it was.
Is it still a common occurrence for PIVs to be covered over by building owners?
Yes, it is.
Would you say that keeping PIVs accessible is an ongoing challenge for gas transporters?
Yes, I would.
Can we go to IGEM G5, RHX 705 at page 64, please? And at paragraph 7.3, we see some statements about PIVs. And it says at 7.3.1, where a network pipeline supplies a multi-occupancy building, a PIV shall be installed outside the building to enable isolation of the building complex. Now, do you understand by the word shall there that means that PIVs are mandatory in multi-occupancy buildings?
Yes.
And if we look down at 7.3.3, it says, any PIV shall be protected with a valve cover and must be permanently identified. Now, do you take from that PIVs must be kept accessible?
I do, yes.
Now, you've accepted earlier that valves like PIVs would be part of the pipeline and part of Caden's regulatory duty to keep in good repair. Does it follow, therefore, that Caden has a duty to keep PIVs operational and accessible?
We have a duty to keep them accessible, and by being accessible, that would make them operational. We don't test their operation when we do our surveys.
Right. If your surveyors had been able to see a PIV, can you just talk me through what they would have done had they seen the PIV, just to make sure it was...
They would see an iron or a plastic box in the footpath, about 6 to 8 inches square. They would lift the lid and see if they could see or access what we call a valve spindle, which is the spindle that we put the key onto to operate the PIV.
Yeah. But they wouldn't actually turn
They
off.
wouldn't turn it, no.
Can you tell me why they wouldn't turn it off?
Because when we turn the valve off, then customers' gas supplies would go off, and they're quarter turn valves, which make them very sensitive.
Right.
PIVs generally are very, very robust bits of equipment, and we would expect them to work if we could see them and they were accessible.
Right.
And we have actually done quite extensive testing on PIVs of various ages to make sure they continue to work.
But part of if a PIV's identified in the footpath, part of the inspection process is to visually identify, open up the access chamber and just see that the PIV is there and not impeded by debris or anything else that might have gotten in.
Correct, yes.
Right. Now, you told me earlier, I think, that PIVs are operated in emergencies. Is that right?
Yes.
Predominantly, it's an emergency bit of kit.
Predominantly, yes.
Yeah. Does that not mean that there's all the more reason to make sure that PIVs are accessible?
Yes.
Just turning first to any PIV that might have been on residential supply 2, so the newer pipe. Can we go to TRI 501417, please? Now, these are the as-laid plans following the installation of residential supply 2. And we can see that in the bottom right-hand corner, there's a date, 6th of February 2017. Do you see that?
I do, yes.
Yeah, we can see a drawing, and it's marked Grenfell Tower in that pinky beige colour. And we can see a black line which has got a markup of EX 18-inch diameter. I think is that a description of the main being
Yeah, I think that means existing 15-inch.
15?
Yeah.
That certainly clarifies something for me. I had not understood that to be 15. Now, there's a red line going from right to left and into the tower, and that appears to be a drawing of the new service pipe going in. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
And there's a symbol with 2 triangles. Is that symbol a valve?
It is, yes.
And does that indicate to you that a PIV was installed at Grenfell Tower?
It does, yes.
So that's outside the building, and that would be accessible.
Yes.
Now, it's not been possible yet to find the valve chamber at Grenfell Tower. Where do you believe it might be?
I believe it would be next to or near to the PIVs of the supplies 1 and 2 on the night of the fire.
Do you...
Sorry, on the day of the survey.
Of course. Do you understand why we can't go today to find the PIV?
I do, yes.
Can you tell me what you
because
think?
I believe it was covered in debris.
Oh, no, I'm sorry. I'm talking about if we were to go today down to the tower,
Yeah.
we can't see the access chamber now. And you say in your witness statement that you believe it's covered by the concrete plinth that
Yes.
gives the elevator up to the tower, to the top of the tower. Is that your evidence?
Yes, I believe we can't see the PIVs because they were either covered over as part of the landscaping work or as part of that concrete plinth.
Yeah. Who put that plinth there, to the best of your knowledge?
I don't know.
Could it be the Metropolitan Police put that there?
It could be, yes, but I don't know who put it there.
But you do believe that the PIV would be there if we could access that part of the pavement?
So I believe, I visited the tower and I saw the plinth, and I believe the PIV is underneath it. Whether there's been landscaping or remediation work on the footpath and then the plinth is on top of that, so that in effect both are covering the PIVs, I don't know.
Very well. I want to turn now to look at the older service, Residential Supply 1. Can we go to CAD 402989? And this is your Exhibit 17. This is the LC21 survey that was completed in 2008. Can we go to page 2 of that? Now, at the bottom of page 2, when we get there, thank you. At the bottom of page 2, we can see section 3E, and it says valves and emergency isolation. And the first question is, has pipe got a ground fire valve? Do you see that?
Yes.
You can see that the surveyor's ticked in biro.
I can.
Yes. Yeah. Now, is that a reference to a PIV?
I believe it is, yeah.
Yeah. Now, on that basis, can we conclude with some certainty that there was a PIV for Residential Supply 1 that was identifiable and accessible in 2008?
I believe so.
If there hadn't been a PIV, would you expect the surveyor to have noted that in a survey in 2008?
I do, where it says, has pipe got a ground fire valve? I believe that that refers to PIV. If he or she couldn't see the PIV, then they would have ticked no.
We saw in the LC21 survey that the surveyor in 2016 couldn't see a PIV on that supply. Does that mean, therefore, that it existed, but it had been covered over or otherwise lost?
I believe so.
Now, we don't have any information about the PIVs being observed on the landlord supply from 2008, but is it possible that the PIV on the landlord supply also existed in 2008 and then was covered over at some point subsequent?
It is, yes.
Now, there's no need to go to this statement unless you want to, but will you say in your first witness statement that PIVs may have been covered up in the landscaping in the refurbishment works in 2016? And those would be the primary refurbishment works where there was cladding and all sorts of the very major works that this inquiry's talked a lot about. Now, if that's right, then the PIVs could have been lost sometime in 2016. Is that right?
They could have been lost sometime between 2008 and 2000.
Well, exactly. There's no way of knowing exactly when.
No.
When, yeah. So I've come to a good time to break, even though it's slightly early.
Well, it doesn't matter. Is it a convenient point for you?
It is. The next topic will take quite some time, so I think it is.
Oh,
a good
well,
time.
that's good reason to stop at this point, I think.
We are making very good progress, though, so.
Good, well done. Well, Mr. Harrison, it's not quite 1 o'clock, but it's obviously a good point at which to have a break. So we'll stop now for some lunch and we'll resume at 2 o'clock, please.
Okay.
And again, please don't talk to anyone about your evidence or anything relating to it over the break.
I won't.
Good. Thank you very much. Would you like to go with the usher then, please? Thank you very much. 2 o'clock then, please.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.